When my son told me not to attend his college graduation, I thought my heart couldn't break any further. I was wrong. The truth is, the graduation wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was realizing that somewhere along the way, the little boy who once held my hand in crowded parking lots had become a young man who seemed ashamed of where he came from. At least, that's how it felt. Looking back now, I can see that the story was more complicated than that. But on that evening, sitting across from my son at my small kitchen table, all I knew was that something had changed between us. And I didn't know how to fix it. My name is Maria Johnson, and at the time, I was 52 years old. For most of my life, I worked jobs people rarely notice. I cleaned houses. I cleaned offices. I worked in restaurants. I did whatever was necessary to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. There is no shame in honest work. I have always believed that. Still, there are moments when the world makes you feel invisible. Moments when people look through you instead of at you. Moments when they only see your job title and never the person behind it. I had experienced those moments before. What I wasn't prepared for was experiencing one with my own son. The evening started normally enough. Ethan had driven home from college for dinner, something that happened less and less often these days. He was in his final semester, preparing to graduate from one of the best universities in the state. I was proud of him. Incredibly proud. Everything in my life had led to this point. Every early morning. Every late-night shift. Every sacrifice. Every difficult choice. None of it felt wasted when I looked at him. He was smart, hardworking, and determined. The kind of young man who made people believe in the future. As we finished dinner, I asked the question every mother asks when graduation is approaching. Have they sent out the final details yet? Ethan nodded. Most of them. I smiled. I need to know where I'm sitting. If I'm going to cry, I want a good seat. For a moment, he laughed. The familiar laugh brought me relief. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The smile faded. His shoulders stiffened. And suddenly, the room felt different. Ethan? He looked down at the table. There's something I wanted to talk to you about. The knot in my stomach appeared instantly. A mother knows when something isn't right. What is it? He took a breath. Then another. As though he were searching for the right words. Mom, graduation is going to be complicated. I frowned. Complicated how? His eyes moved toward the window before finally returning to me. There are going to be a lot of people there. I waited. Professors. A pause. Recruiters. Another pause. Ashley's family. Ashley. I knew the name well. Ashley Morgan had been Ethan's girlfriend for almost a year. She came from a wealthy family with connections that seemed to open doors everywhere. I had met her a few times. She was polite. Friendly, even. But I always felt as though I were visiting a world that wasn't built for people like me. What does that have to do with me? I asked gently. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. A nervous habit he'd had since childhood. It's hard to explain. Try. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. When he finally looked at me again, I noticed something unexpected. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't cruelty. It was fear. The kind of fear people feel when they're trying desperately to fit into a world they don't completely understand. I just don't want anything to feel awkward. The word landed heavily between us. Awkward. Not offensive. Not cruel. Yet painful all the same. I looked down at my hands. Hands shaped by decades of work. Hands that had cleaned floors, washed dishes, folded laundry, and carried far more than their share of burdens. For the first time, I wondered if Ethan saw those hands differently now. If he saw struggle instead of sacrifice. If he saw embarrassment instead of love. Are you asking me not to come? The question left my mouth before I could stop it. Ethan immediately looked uncomfortable. His eyes widened. No. But the hesitation came too late. We both heard it. He leaned forward. That's not what I mean. Then what do you mean? Another long silence filled the room. Finally, he sighed. I just think things would be easier. Easier. Perhaps that was the moment my heart began to break. Not because he hated me. Not because he didn't love me. But because he was beginning to see me as part of a life he was trying to leave behind. And I wasn't sure he even realized it. I forced a small smile. The kind mothers learn to wear when they're trying not to cry. I understand. It wasn't entirely true. But I wanted to believe it was. Relief flashed across Ethan's face, and that hurt more than anything else. Because it told me this conversation had been weighing on him for a long time. A few minutes later, he stood and grabbed his jacket. I should head back. I nodded. Drive carefully. He hugged me before leaving. The hug felt genuine. Warm. Familiar. And that made everything more confusing. Because the son who hugged me goodbye was still the same boy I had loved his entire life. Yet somehow, he was also becoming someone I no longer recognized. After the door closed behind him, I remained at the kitchen table for a long time. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the sun slowly disappeared beneath the horizon. Inside, memories began surfacing one after another. A 6-year-old boy crying after losing his father. A teenager studying late into the night. A young man opening his college acceptance letter. Every version of Ethan existed in my mind at once. And every version of him seemed easier to understand than the one sitting across from me tonight. Eventually, I stood and walked toward the refrigerator. Pinned to the door was his graduation announcement. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I asked myself a question I never thought I would have to ask. Had I spent 22 years helping my son build a future that no longer had room for me? At the time, I didn't know the answer. What I did know was this: graduation was only 2 weeks away. And before it arrived, both of us were about to learn a lesson neither of us would ever forget. People often assume that sacrifice happens in a single dramatic moment. A life-changing decision. A grand gesture. A heroic act. But most sacrifice doesn't look like that. Most sacrifice is quiet. It happens in alarm clocks ringing before sunrise, in tired feet that keep moving, and in promises made to yourself when nobody else is listening. For me, sacrifice looked a lot like survival. After my husband died, survival became my full-time job. I was 29 years old, raising a 6-year-old boy on my own, and trying to navigate a future I had never imagined. One day I was part of a family of 3. The next, it felt as though the ground beneath us had disappeared. The first year was the hardest. Not because we lost everything. We didn't. Not because life became impossible. It didn't. The hardest part was pretending I wasn't terrified. Every morning, Ethan looked at me expecting answers. Expecting safety. Expecting certainty. And I quickly learned something about parenthood: children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who keep showing up. So that's what I did. I showed up. Every single day. My alarm rang at 4:30 each morning. Before the sun rose, before most of the city was awake, would quietly get dressed and start preparing breakfast. Sometimes it was eggs and toast. Sometimes cereal. Sometimes whatever I could afford that week. Before leaving, I always wrote a note. Have a great day. Good luck on your test. Love you. They were small things, but I wanted Ethan to begin every morning knowing someone believed in him. Then I headed to my first job. Most days, I cleaned houses in neighborhoods that felt like a different world. The homes were beautiful, with large kitchens, polished floors, and backyards bigger than the apartment complex where we lived. As I dusted bookshelves and vacuumed carpets, I often found myself wondering what life was like for the families who lived there. Did they worry about money? Did they lie awake at night doing mental math before paying bills? Did they ever stand in grocery store aisles calculating which items they could put back? Maybe some did. Maybe some didn't. Either way, I reminded myself that comparing lives rarely brings peace. Around noon, I left for my second job at a local diner. The work was exhausting but steady. For 6 hours I carried trays, refilled coffee cups, and smiled at customers whether they smiled back or not. Some regulars were wonderful. Others barely looked at me. One businessman came in nearly every Thursday. He never learned my name despite seeing me for years. "Miss," he would say while snapping his fingers. I hated it. Not because it was difficult. Because it reminded me how easy it is for people to overlook those serving them. Still, I smiled. Tips helped pay bills. Pride didn't. After finishing my shift, I picked Ethan up from a neighbor's house, helped him with homework, made dinner, and listened to stories about school. Those hours were my favorite part of every day. No matter how tired I felt. No matter how much my back hurt. No matter how badly I wanted sleep. When Ethan talked about science projects or basketball practice, the stress faded for a little while. He gave meaning to the struggle. Around 9 each night, I left for my third job cleaning office buildings downtown. That was the shift few people knew about. The city looked different after midnight. The crowds disappeared. The streets grew quiet. Office towers glowed against the dark sky like giant lanterns. Sometimes, while vacuuming conference rooms or emptying trash bins, would stop for a moment and look out the windows. Far below, traffic lights blinked through the darkness. Above me stretched dozens of floors filled with people who had careers, opportunities, and educations I never received. I didn't envy them. Not exactly. But I hoped Ethan might someday sit in one of those offices. Not because success would make him better than anyone else. Because I wanted him to have choices. Choices had always felt like a luxury. One winter evening, I came home after 2 in the morning during a snowstorm. The roads were nearly empty, and my entire body ached from exhaustion. When I quietly opened Ethan's bedroom door to kiss him goodnight, I noticed he was awake. His eyes were red. Tears covered his cheeks. My heart immediately sank. I sat beside him. "What's wrong?" For several seconds, he didn't answer. Then he finally whispered, "The kids at school say we're poor." The words hit harder than I expected. I had spent years protecting him from adult worries, but children notice more than we realize. They made fun of my clothes. I wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "And?" He stared at the blanket. "They said you're just a cleaning lady." For a moment, I struggled to find the right response. Part of me wanted to tell him those children were wrong. But they weren't wrong about what I did. What they were wrong about was what it meant. I gently lifted his chin so he would look at me. "There's nothing wrong with honest work, Ethan." He searched my face. "Really? Really?" I smiled. People can judge jobs all they want. What matters is the kind of person you become. He thought about that for a moment before asking the question every struggling parent fears. Will we always be poor? The room fell quiet. I could have given him a speech. I could have avoided the question. Instead, I chose honesty. "I don't know." His face dropped. Then I squeezed his hand. "But I do know this. Your future doesn't have to look exactly like our present." Something changed in his expression. Hope. Just a little. But enough. Years later, I would still remember that look. Because it became fuel. For both of us. As Ethan grew older, he worked harder than any student I had ever known. He stayed after school for tutoring, spent weekends studying, and treated every opportunity as though it mattered. Teachers noticed. Coaches noticed. Neighbors noticed. And so did I. Every report card earned a place on our refrigerator. Every achievement felt like a shared victory. One afternoon during his sophomore year of high school, he burst through the front door carrying a sheet of paper. His face was glowing. "Mom." I looked up from folding laundry. "What happened?" He handed me the paper. "I got the highest score in the district." For a moment, I simply stared at him. Then I started crying. Not because I was emotional. Well, maybe a little. But mostly because I could finally see the future beginning to open for him. The future we had spent years chasing. Ethan laughed and shook his head. "Why are you crying?" I pulled him into a hug. "Because one day you're going to do incredible things." He smiled. Then he said something neither of us would ever forget. "When I grow up, you won't have to work 3 jobs. Anymore." I laughed. "That's the plan? That's the promise." At the time, he meant every word. And I believed him. What neither of us understood was that success has a way of testing people. Not when they're struggling. When they're finally given the chance to leave that struggle behind. Years later, I would think about that promise often. Especially on the day my son asked me not to attend his graduation. Because the little boy making that promise was real. He wasn't pretending. Somewhere inside the young man Ethan was becoming, that boy still existed. The question was whether life would allow him to find his way back. The envelope arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. At first, it looked like any other piece of mail mixed in with utility bills, grocery coupons, and advertisements. But the moment I noticed the university logo in the corner, my heart began to race. For months, Ethan had been waiting to hear back from several colleges. For months, I had pretended to stay calm. The truth was, I was just as nervous as he was. Maybe more. I carried the envelope into the kitchen and stared at it for a moment before calling upstairs. "Ethan." A few seconds later, I heard footsteps. "What?" Then he saw the envelope. Everything changed. The color drained from his face. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan reached for it. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the letter. I watched his eyes move across the page. One line. Then another. Then another. Suddenly, he looked up. And smiled. A huge, unstoppable smile. "Mom." I already knew. I got in. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then we were laughing, crying, and hugging all at once. The university had accepted him. Not just any university. His dream school. The school he had talked about for years. The school that felt completely out of reach when he was younger. I remember looking at him that evening and thinking about all the versions of Ethan that had existed along the way. The little boy afraid of being poor forever. The teenager studying late at the kitchen table. The young man who refused to quit even when things became difficult. All of those versions had led to this moment. That night we celebrated with takeout pizza and store-brand soda. Nothing fancy. Nothing expensive. But it remains one of the happiest nights of my life. For hours, we talked about the future. Dorm rooms. Classes. Professors. Campus traditions. The possibilities seemed endless. For the first time in a long while, the future felt bigger than our circumstances. Then reality arrived. A few weeks later, the financial aid package showed up. I sat at the kitchen table studying the numbers while Ethan stood beside me. The scholarship money helped. A lot. But not enough. There would still be tuition costs. Housing expenses. Books. Transportation. Unexpected fees. The total made my stomach tighten. Ethan noticed immediately. "We can figure it out." I smiled. We will. But later that night, after he went to bed, I sat alone with a calculator and a notebook. I ran the numbers over and over again. Each time, the result was the same. We were short. Very short. I barely slept. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with the bank. Looking back, taking that loan was one of the scariest decisions I ever made. Not because I doubted Ethan. I never doubted him. I doubted whether I could carry the financial burden if something went wrong. The loan officer reviewed the paperwork quietly. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair. This is a significant amount of debt. I know. You understand the risk? I nodded. Yes. He studied me for a moment. Then asked a question I still remember. Would you do this if it were for anyone else? The answer came instantly. No. Because there was only one person in the world I would have signed those papers for. My son. A few months later, move-in day arrived. The campus looked exactly like it did in the brochures. Beautiful brick buildings. Tree-lined walkways. Students carrying boxes into dormitories. Families taking photographs. Excitement everywhere. As we unpacked Ethan's belongings, I could see how happy he was. Not nervous. Not intimidated. Excited. He belonged there. The realization filled me with pride. At one point, a student stopped by the room to introduce himself. Then another. Then another. Within an hour, Ethan was already making friends. Watching him interact with people from different cities, backgrounds, and experiences made me realize how much he had grown. When it was finally time to leave, neither of us wanted to say goodbye. I hugged him tightly. You'll be fine. He laughed. I know. Then he hugged me again. This time longer. Thank you. The words caught me off guard. For what? For everything. I smiled. Just make it count. I will. At the time, I believed him completely. And for a while, things went exactly as we hoped. Ethan thrived. His grades were excellent. Professors praised his work. He joined student organizations. Built friendships. Applied for internships. Every phone call brought new accomplishments. Every visit home brought new stories. It felt as though years of sacrifice were finally paying off. But change rarely arrives all at once. More often, it arrives quietly. So quietly that you don't recognize it until much later. The first signs were small. Almost impossible to notice. At first, Ethan called every evening. Then every few days. Then once a week. Eventually, 2 weeks would pass without a conversation. I told myself it was normal. Because it was. College students get busy. They build lives of their own. That doesn't mean they love their families any less. Still, I occasionally sensed something changing beneath the surface. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to surprise him. I packed his favorite homemade lasagna into a cooler and drove 3 hours to campus. I imagined us eating lunch together and catching up. The visit started well. Ethan seemed genuinely happy to see me. But throughout the afternoon, I noticed something unusual. Not in what he said. In what he didn't say. Several of his friends stopped to chat. Whenever conversations turned toward family backgrounds, Ethan became noticeably more reserved. He wasn't ashamed. Not yet. But he seemed increasingly aware of differences. Differences in money. Differences in opportunities. Differences in upbringing. Many of his classmates came from families with resources I could never provide. Parents who were doctors. Lawyers. Executives. Business owners. People who spoke confidently about investments, vacations abroad, and professional connections. For the first time, Ethan was surrounded by a world far different from the one he grew up in. A world where success often seemed expected rather than earned. As I drove home that evening, I found myself wondering what that experience felt like for him. Not because I was worried. Because I was curious. I remembered being his age. Wanting to belong. Wanting to fit in. Wanting people to see your potential rather than your circumstances. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much pressure he must have been carrying. Pressure to succeed. Pressure to compete. Pressure to prove he deserved to be there. Months passed. Then one evening during a phone call, Ethan mentioned someone new. A girl from one of his classes. At first, it sounded casual. Nothing unusual. But as he talked, I noticed something. For the first time in months, he sounded excited about something other than grades or internships. Her name was Ashley Morgan. And although neither of us knew it yet, she was about to become an important part of both our lives. At the time, I thought she was simply another college girlfriend. Looking back now, I realize Ashley represented something much bigger. Not because of who she was. Because of the world she came from. A world Ethan desperately wanted to be part of. And a world that would eventually test everything he believed about himself, his family, and the sacrifices that had brought him there. The first time I met Ashley Morgan, I understood immediately why Ethan liked her. She was intelligent, confident, and easy to talk to. More importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in the people around her, something that is rarer than most people realize. For months, I had imagined meeting the girl Ethan couldn't stop talking about. By the time family weekend arrived, I felt as though I already knew her. At least a little. What I didn't realize was that meeting Ashley also meant getting a closer look at the world she came from. And that world was very different from mine. The university campus was crowded when I arrived. Parents filled the walkways carrying cameras and coffee cups. Students introduced family members to roommates, professors, and friends. Everywhere I looked, people seemed excited to show where they came from and who had helped them get there. For the first hour, everything felt comfortable. Then Ethan introduced me to Ashley and her parents. Richard and Victoria Morgan. They were polite. Friendly, even. But there was a confidence about them that came from generations of financial security. They spoke easily about investments, travel, and business opportunities in a way that reminded me how different our lives had been. I didn't dislike them. In fact, they treated me respectfully. The uncomfortable feeling came from somewhere else. It came from me. From suddenly becoming aware of the gap between our worlds. As lunch continued, conversations drifted from one topic to another. Career paths. Graduate schools. Internships. Professional networking. Subjects I knew very little about. Most of the time, I listened. Occasionally, someone would ask a question, and I would answer honestly. When Richard eventually asked what I did for work, I smiled. A little bit of everything. He laughed. What does that mean? It means I've spent most of my life working multiple jobs. What kind of jobs? I clean houses, work occasional restaurant shifts, and do commercial cleaning. Richard nodded thoughtfully. That's a lot of hard work. The conversation moved on. No judgment. No awkward silence. Nothing dramatic. Yet something interesting happened. I noticed Ethan become unusually quiet. Not embarrassed. Not exactly. More cautious. As though he suddenly became aware that the people around him were seeing parts of his life he normally kept separate. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Looking back, should have paid closer attention. Because that moment wasn't really about me. It was about Ethan. He was trying to belong to two different worlds at the same time. The world he came from. And the world he hoped to enter. The problem was that he hadn't yet figured out how to connect the two. Later that afternoon, Ashley and I found ourselves walking across campus while Ethan stopped to speak with a professor. For a few minutes, we chatted about ordinary things. Classes. The weather. Her plans after graduation. Then she asked a question. What was Ethan like as a kid? I laughed. Determined. Still is. Stubborn too. Ashley smiled. I've noticed. For the next several minutes, I shared stories from Ethan's childhood. The science fair projects that took over our apartment. The basketball games. The endless questions about how everything worked. Ashley listened attentively. She seemed genuinely interested. When Ethan eventually caught up with us, she turned toward him. I love hearing these stories. Ethan smiled, but something about his expression seemed uncomfortable. Not because he didn't want Ashley to know. Because he didn't want to feel vulnerable. I would understand that much later. Young adults spend years trying to build identities for themselves. Sometimes family stories remind them of how far they've come. Sometimes they remind them of how far they think they still need to go. As the months passed, Ashley became a larger part of Ethan's life. They studied together. Attended events together. Applied for internships together. For the first time, Ethan seemed to be building a future that extended beyond grades and career goals. And I was happy for him. I truly was. The changes didn't happen overnight. They rarely do. Instead, they arrived in small moments. Moments that seemed harmless on their own. A missed phone call here. A shortened conversation there. A holiday visit cut a little shorter than usual. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth arguing about. Yet when those moments began adding up, I started noticing the distance. The most difficult part wasn't that Ethan was pulling away. Young adults are supposed to build independent lives. The difficult part was that he seemed increasingly uncomfortable discussing where he came from. One afternoon, I attended a campus presentation where Ethan was speaking as part of a student leadership program. Afterward, groups of students and parents gathered to talk. The atmosphere was relaxed and informal. As I stood nearby, I overheard part of a conversation. One student asked Ethan about his family. Nothing unusual. The question came up. Naturally. At first, Ethan answered normally. Then the student asked what his parents did. For a brief moment, Ethan hesitated. It wasn't a long pause. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed it. I did. Eventually, he smiled and said, "My mom works back home." That was all. The conversation continued. Nobody thought twice about it. But the answer stayed with me. Not because it was inaccurate. Because it was incomplete. For the first time, I wondered whether Ethan was starting to simplify parts of his story. Not because he was ashamed. Because he was trying to fit in. Trying to control how people saw him. Trying to become the person he thought he needed to be. That evening, while driving home, I found myself thinking about something my husband once told me. Success doesn't change people. I remember asking him what he meant. His answer had been simple. It reveals them. At the time, I wasn't sure whether that was true. Now I wasn't so certain. Because what I saw happening with Ethan didn't feel like arrogance. It felt like insecurity. The kind of insecurity that hides behind ambition. The kind that quietly whispers, "You're not enough. You don't belong here. You need to become someone else." The more pressure Ethan felt to prove himself, the more he seemed to distance himself from the parts of his life that reminded him where he started. Unfortunately, those parts included me. Several months later, graduation season began approaching. Job offers were being discussed. Recruiters were visiting campus. Students were planning their futures. Everyone seemed focused on what came next. Especially Ethan. One evening during a phone call, he mentioned that Ashley's father had introduced him to several business contacts. I could hear the excitement in his voice. The opportunities were real. Important. Potentially life-changing. And I was genuinely happy for him. Yet after we hung up, I found myself sitting quietly in my kitchen, staring at my coffee long after it had gone cold. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, I felt uneasy. Not because Ethan was succeeding. Because he seemed increasingly convinced that success required him to become someone different. Someone more polished. More impressive. More acceptable. I hoped I was wrong. I wanted to be wrong. But a few weeks later, Ethan sat across from me at this very kitchen table and began a conversation neither of us would ever forget. The conversation about graduation. The conversation that would break both our hearts. At the time, I thought Ashley's world was pulling my son away from me. Years later, I realized I had been blaming the wrong thing. The real problem wasn't Ashley. The real problem was that Ethan had started measuring his worth through the eyes of other people. And that is a lesson life eventually collects payment for. Graduation was less than 2 weeks away. For most families, it was a celebration. For me, it felt like the end of a journey that had begun more than 20 years earlier. Whenever people asked what I was most proud of, I never mentioned surviving difficult years or working multiple jobs. I always talked about Ethan. His determination. His kindness. His ability to keep going when life became difficult. Watching him prepare to graduate felt like watching a dream come true. Not my dream. His. The one he had earned through years of hard work. Still, if I'm being honest, it felt a little like our victory too. Not because I deserved credit. Because we had walked different parts of the same road. In the weeks leading up to graduation, I found myself thinking constantly about the ceremony. I imagined where I would sit. The photographs we would take afterward. The smile on Ethan's face when he crossed the stage. Sometimes I even pictured visiting his father's grave afterward and telling him the news. We did it. Your son did it. One Saturday morning, I opened a wooden box that had remained untouched for years. Inside were photographs, old letters, and a few keepsakes I could never bring myself to throw away. At the bottom rested a silver watch. My husband's watch. The last one he ever owned. I picked it up carefully. The metal felt cool in my hands. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Then I smiled. I knew exactly what Ethan's graduation gift would be. The watch wasn't valuable in a financial sense. But it carried something far more important. History. Memory. Family. It represented where he came from and the people who had believed in him before anyone else did. I spent the afternoon cleaning it, polishing the glass, and placing it inside a small gift box. The process brought me an unexpected sense of peace. No matter what happened next, I wanted Ethan to have something that connected him to his father. A few days later, my phone rang while I was making dinner. The caller ID displayed Ethan's name. I answered immediately. Hi, sweetheart. Hey, Mom. Something about his voice made me stop stirring the soup. He sounded distracted. Not rushed. Not annoyed. Uneasy. The kind of uneasy that usually means someone has been rehearsing a conversation in their head. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things. Classes. Graduation plans. Job interviews. Then a silence settled between us. The kind that feels heavier than it should. Finally, Ethan spoke. Mom, there's something I've been trying to figure out how to say. My stomach tightened. What is it? He exhaled slowly. I don't want you to take this the wrong way. That sentence rarely leads anywhere good. I waited. Ethan? He hesitated. Then came the words. I don't think graduation is going to be what we expected. I frowned. What does that mean? Another pause. Longer this time. There are going to be a lot of people there. The explanation sounded familiar. Too familiar. Recruiters. Faculty members. Future colleagues. Ashley's family. The same world Ethan had spent years trying to prove he belonged to. I leaned against the kitchen counter. What are you trying to tell me? For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he finally answered. I think it might be easier if you didn't come. The words landed softly. Yet they hurt more than if he had shouted them. I closed my eyes. Not because I was angry. Because I needed a moment to absorb what I had just heard. When I finally spoke, my voice was surprisingly calm. Why? I don't know how to explain it. Try. Another silence. Then another. I could hear him searching for the right words. The problem was that there weren't any. Not for a conversation like this. Eventually, he said something that broke my heart because I knew he believed it. I've spent years building relationships with people who can help me start my career. I listened. Everyone's going to be meeting everyone. His voice grew quieter. And I just don't want anything to feel complicated. Complicated. A different word. The same pain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in my chest for months. Are you embarrassed by me? The answer came immediately. No. This time, there was no hesitation. No uncertainty. Just conviction. And strangely enough, that made the situation harder to understand. Because I believed him. He wasn't embarrassed by me. Not exactly. What he was embarrassed by was the story. The poverty. The struggle. The uncertainty. Everything he had spent years trying to move beyond. Unfortunately, those things were woven into my life. And into his. Whether he wanted them there or not. Mom. His voice cracked slightly. I don't know. That honest answer hurt more than any lie could have. Because it revealed the truth. He was confused. Lost. Trying to become someone he hadn't fully figured out yet. I looked down at my hands. The same hands that had packed school lunches, worked overnight shifts, and signed loan papers for his education. For the first time, I wondered if success was asking him to choose between where he came from and where he wanted to go. If so, he was making a terrible mistake. No one should have to choose. And yet people do it every day. I understand, I said softly. It wasn't entirely true. But it was the closest thing I had. Relief appeared in his voice almost immediately. Not relief that I wouldn't come. Relief that the conversation was over. That hurt too. We talked for another minute or two before ending the call. Nothing dramatic happened. No argument. No accusations. No tears. At least not while he was listening. After the call ended, I stood alone in the kitchen staring out the window as the evening sun disappeared behind the neighboring buildings. The apartment felt unusually quiet. Eventually, I walked into my bedroom and opened the closet. Inside sat the small gift box containing his father's watch. I picked it up and held it for a long time. For years, I had imagined handing it to Ethan after the ceremony. I imagined photographs. Celebration. Pride. A moment shared between mother and son. Now I wasn't sure any of those things would happen. I sat on the edge of the bed and allowed myself to cry. Not because Ethan had become a bad person. He hadn't. Not because he no longer loved me. I knew he did. I cried because I could see him struggling with something he didn't yet understand. He thought success meant being accepted by the people around him. He thought belonging required distance from the parts of his life that felt uncomfortable. He thought he was protecting his future. What he didn't realize was that every step away from his story was also a step away from himself. Hours later, after the tears had stopped, I made a decision. I wasn't going to call him back. I wasn't going to argue. And I certainly wasn't going to create a scene. But I also wasn't going to miss the moment we had spent 22 years working toward. I would attend the ceremony. Quietly. Respectfully. Without drawing attention to myself. Not because Ethan owed me anything. Because some moments are simply too important to surrender to fear. As I placed the gift box back in the closet, one thought stayed with me. Perhaps graduation would not unfold the way I had imagined. Perhaps it would hurt. But deep down, I knew something else. One day, Ethan would look back on this conversation. And when he did, he would finally understand why it broke my heart. The question was whether life would teach him that lesson gently. Or the hard way. Graduation day arrived with clear skies and a warm spring breeze. It was the kind of day families hope for when they imagine milestone moments. The kind of day people photograph, celebrate, and remember for years. For me, it was the day I had been working toward for more than 2 decades. I woke before sunrise. Not because I needed to. Because sleep had been impossible. Part of me was excited. Part of me was anxious. And part of me still wondered whether I was making the right decision. After all, Ethan had asked me not to come. Not directly. Not in so many words. But the meaning had been clear enough. Even so, every time I considered staying home, the same thought returned. If I missed this day, I would regret it for the rest of my life. So I got dressed. I chose a navy blue dress I reserved for special occasions and spent a little extra time fixing my hair. Before leaving, I picked up the small gift box containing his father's watch and slipped it into my purse. Then I headed to campus. The university was already crowded when I arrived. Families filled the sidewalks. Parents carried flowers. Grandparents searched for seats. Students posed for photographs beneath banners and campus landmarks. The atmosphere felt joyful. Hopeful. The entire place seemed to vibrate with possibility. For a moment, I simply stood there watching. Watching families celebrate. Watching proud parents take pictures. Watching students laugh with friends. I wondered how many people around me had traveled difficult roads to reach this day. Probably more than anyone realized. Eventually, I found my seat near the top of the stadium. Not because I had to. Because it felt right. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to witness. From the last row, I could see everything. The stage. The graduates. The families. The future unfolding in real time. As the ceremony began, my eyes searched until I found Ethan among the sea of caps and gowns. The sight immediately brought tears to my eyes. He looked confident. Capable. Ready. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about our recent conversation. I wasn't thinking about hurt feelings. I wasn't thinking about disappointment. I was simply proud. Proud of the young man he had become. The speeches came and went. Then the graduates began crossing the stage. One by one. Name after name. Applause after applause. When the announcer finally called Ethan Johnson, my heart nearly stopped. I watched him stand. Walk confidently across the platform. Accept his diploma. Shake hands. Smile for the camera. The crowd applauded. And somewhere in the very last row, a mother quietly cried. Not because she was sad. Because she was grateful. For years, I had worried about whether all the sacrifices would matter. In that moment, they did. The ceremony ended to cheers and celebration. Families flooded onto the field. Graduates rushed toward parents, grandparents, and friends. The stadium quickly transformed into a sea of hugs, photographs, and happy tears. For several minutes, I remained seated. Partly because I wanted to avoid creating an awkward situation. Partly because I simply wanted to watch. Eventually, I stood and made my way down toward the field. The crowd was thick, making it easy to blend in. I spotted Ethan almost immediately. He was surrounded by people. Friends. Professors. Ashley. Members of the Morgan family. Everyone seemed excited. Everyone seemed proud of him. As they should have been. I considered leaving the gift with campus staff and heading home. But before I could decide, Ethan looked up. Our eyes met. His smile disappeared. Not out of anger. Out of surprise. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he excused himself from the group and walked toward me. Mom. The word came out softly. Not happily. Not unhappily. Just uncertain. Congratulations, I said. A small smile returned to his face. Thank you. For a moment, things felt almost normal. Then several people from the group began walking toward us. The distance closed quickly. I could see Ethan becoming uncomfortable. Not because I was there. Because two different parts of his life were suddenly colliding. And he wasn't prepared for it. One of his professors arrived first. Ethan, there you are. The professor smiled and turned toward me. Oh, hello. Before I could respond, Ethan quickly stepped forward. This is Maria. The words weren't wrong. Maria was my name. But hearing them still stung. Not because he had introduced me incorrectly. Because he hadn't introduced me completely. The professor smiled politely and shook my hand. It's wonderful to meet you. I thanked him. A few more people joined the conversation. Ashley greeted me warmly. Her parents did the same. Nobody was rude. Nobody was dismissive. In fact, everyone seemed perfectly kind. Yet throughout the interaction, I noticed something. Ethan never once said the words, my mother. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. He simply kept steering conversations elsewhere. Toward jobs. Toward future plans. Toward networking opportunities. Toward anything except the story standing right beside him. And somehow that hurt more than open rejection would have. Because I could see what was happening. He wasn't hiding me. He was hiding the version of himself connected to me. The version that reminded him where he started. The version he feared others might judge. Whether that fear was real or imagined no longer mattered. It had already changed him. At one point, one of Ashley's relatives smiled and asked how long I had known Ethan. The question was harmless. Almost humorous. But I noticed Ethan freeze. Just briefly. Then he laughed. A very long time. Everyone chuckled. The conversation moved on. No one thought twice about it. No one except me. Because in that tiny moment, I saw the conflict he had been carrying for months. The pressure. The insecurity. The exhausting effort of trying to become someone new without fully accepting who he already was. For the first time, I felt less hurt. And more sad for him. Success should never require that much pretending. After a while, I reached into my purse and removed the gift box. I almost forgot. Ethan looked surprised. What's this? Your graduation present. He accepted it carefully. For a second, I thought he might open it immediately. Instead, he held it against his chest. Thank you. His voice sounded different. More emotional. More genuine. I smiled. Your father would have been proud of you. The words hit him hard. I could see it in his eyes. The guilt. The regret. The things neither of us were ready to discuss. Not today. Today belonged to his achievement. Not our wounds. I leaned forward and kissed his cheek. The same way I had when he was little. Then I stepped back. I should let you celebrate. His expression changed. For the first time all afternoon, he looked uncertain. As though he wanted to say something. As though he knew something important had been left unsaid. But the moment passed. People called his name from across the field. Photos still needed to be taken. Conversations still needed to happen. Life kept moving. It always does. Drive. Safely, he said. I nodded. You too. Then I turned and walked away. No dramatic confrontation. No angry speech. No public humiliation. Just a quiet goodbye beneath a bright spring sky. Yet by the time I reached my car, tears had already begun filling my eyes. Because I finally understood something. The distance between Ethan and me wasn't caused by money. Or Ashley. Or college. It was caused by fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of not belonging. Fear of being seen as less than. The tragedy was that the people judging him most harshly weren't standing around him on that field. They existed only inside his own mind. As I started the engine and prepared to drive home, one final thought crossed my mind. I hoped life would teach my son that lesson sooner rather than later. Because if it didn't, he would spend years chasing approval from people who could never give him what he truly needed. What I didn't know was that life was already preparing that lesson. And it was coming much sooner than either of us expected. A year after graduation, Ethan Johnson had the kind of life he once dreamed about. He lived in New York City. He worked for a respected consulting firm. His salary was more money than our family had ever imagined earning when he was growing up. From the outside, everything looked successful. The job. The apartment. The professional network. The future. If someone had met him during that period, they probably would have described him as ambitious, driven, and fortunate. In many ways, they would have been right. The problem was that success wasn't making him happy. At first, Ethan ignored the feeling. Most young professionals struggle during their first year. Long hours. High expectations. Constant pressure. That was normal. Or at least, that's what everyone told him. So he kept pushing forward. The way he always had. Work harder. Achieve more. Stay focused. The rewards would eventually come. Yet the further he moved into the life he had worked so hard to build, the more disconnected he began to feel. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years, he had been chasing opportunity. Now he was surrounded by it. And somehow he felt more uncertain than ever. Part of the problem was that his life had become almost entirely transactional. Conversations revolved around projects, promotions, and professional goals. Networking events replaced genuine friendships. Relationships increasingly felt connected to achievement rather than connection. Everyone seemed busy. Everyone seemed ambitious. Everyone seemed to be performing success. Including him. Especially him. One evening, after returning home from work, Ethan found himself standing in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual. He looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. The face staring back at him seemed unfamiliar. For the first time, he asked himself a question he had been avoiding for months. Who am I trying so hard to impress? The answer never came. Instead, life continued moving forward. Then came the restructuring. The announcement arrived on an ordinary Monday morning. Several departments would be merged. Budgets would be reduced. Positions would be eliminated. No one panicked at first. Corporate restructuring happened all the time. Most employees assumed they would be fine. Ethan did too. After all, his performance reviews were strong. His managers respected his work. His future seemed secure. 3 weeks later, he found himself sitting in a conference room listening to a human resources representative explain that his position was being eliminated. The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. Afterward, he packed his belongings into a cardboard box and took the elevator downstairs. By noon, he was standing outside the building. Unemployed. The city around him looked exactly the same. People hurried along sidewalks. Traffic filled the streets. Business meetings continued. No one knew his life had just changed. No one cared. That realization was strangely unsettling. For years, he had believed professional success would provide security. Now he understood how fragile that security could be. The following months were difficult. Not catastrophic. Just difficult. Job applications. Interviews. Rejections. More interviews. More waiting. The uncertainty slowly eroded his confidence. For the first time since college, Ethan wasn't sure what came next. Around the same time, his relationship with Ashley began to change. Not because of the layoff. Not directly. The problems had started earlier. Long before either of them admitted it. One evening they sat together in his apartment after dinner. The conversation drifted from work to future plans. Eventually, Ashley became unusually quiet. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" She looked down at her coffee. Then back at him. "I miss you." He frowned. "I'm right here." A sad smile crossed her face. "That's exactly what I mean." The words hung between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ashley continued. "You haven't been happy in a long time." Ethan looked away. "I've just been stressed." "Maybe." She paused. "But I think it's more than that." He wanted to argue. Instead, he listened. Because part of him knew she was right. Ashley leaned forward. "You spend so much time trying to become the person you think everyone expects you to be." Her voice remained gentle. "I don't think you even know what you want anymore." The observation hit harder than Ethan expected. Not because it was cruel. Because it felt true. Over the next several weeks, they had more conversations like that. Honest conversations. Difficult conversations. The kind couples sometimes avoid until they become unavoidable. Eventually, both of them reached the same conclusion. They cared about each other. But they were moving in different directions. There was no dramatic fight. No betrayal. No villain. Just two people realizing that affection alone isn't always enough to sustain a future together. The breakup hurt. More than Ethan expected. Not because Ashley abandoned him. Because she had understood parts of him that he was only beginning to understand himself. When she left, she said something he would remember for years. "I hope you figure out who you're living for." At the time, he wasn't sure what she meant. Months later, he would. The weeks that followed were some of the loneliest of Ethan's life. Without work and without the relationship that had shaped much of his college and early professional years, he suddenly had more time than he knew what to do with. And time has a way of exposing things we normally avoid. One rainy evening, while searching through old files on his laptop, he stumbled across a folder labeled Family. Curious, he opened it. Hundreds of photographs appeared. Birthdays. School events. Basketball games. Holiday dinners. Graduation pictures. Memories. At first, he smiled. Then he grew quiet. Because the photographs revealed something he had spent years overlooking. In nearly every picture, Maria was there. Not at the center. Not seeking attention. Just present. Supporting. Encouraging. Showing up. The images triggered memories he hadn't revisited in years. The notes beside breakfast bowls. The late-night rides home. The overtime shifts. The sacrifices he once noticed without being told. Then he found a photograph taken outside their apartment when he was 12 years old. He remembered that day immediately. His mother had worked nearly 16 hours before attending one of his school events. Yet she had still smiled the entire evening. Looking at the photo now, he noticed how exhausted she seemed. A detail he had missed as a child. And perhaps as an adult too. For hours, Ethan sat quietly scrolling through memories. Then another image appeared. Graduation day. The stadium. The field. His mother. The gift box. A knot formed in his stomach. Because suddenly he saw the day differently. Not through his own eyes. Through hers. He remembered introducing her as Maria. He remembered redirecting conversations. He remembered trying to manage perceptions rather than simply being present. At the time, it had felt harmless. Now it felt heartbreaking. A few minutes later, Ethan stood and walked toward a bookshelf. Resting on the top shelf was the graduation gift he still hadn't opened. He picked it up slowly. The realization alone filled him with shame. An entire year had passed. And he had never looked inside. Carefully, he removed the wrapping paper. Then opened the box. The moment he saw the watch, everything stopped. His father's watch. The watch he remembered from childhood. The watch his mother had protected for decades. Beneath it sat a folded note. His hands trembled as he opened it. The message was simple. Short. Written in Maria's familiar handwriting. It ended with words he couldn't stop reading. I have always been proud of you. Love, Mom, always. Not before graduation. Not before the mistakes. Always. The realization broke something inside him. Or perhaps it repaired something that had been broken for years. For the first time since leaving home, Ethan allowed himself to fully acknowledge the truth. His mother had never stopped believing in him. Not once. The real question was whether he had stopped believing in himself. As rain tapped softly against the apartment windows, Ethan sat alone holding his father's watch. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't thinking about career plans. Or status. Or expectations. He was thinking about home. About the small apartment where every dream began. About a woman who spent decades sacrificing so he could build a future. About a graduation day that neither of them would ever forget. And for the first time, he understood what Ashley had been trying to tell him. He had spent years living for approval. Years trying to become someone impressive. Someone successful. Someone accepted. In the process, he had drifted away from the people who knew him best. The people who loved him before success ever entered the picture. By the time the rain finally stopped, Ethan had made a decision. It wasn't a complicated decision. In fact, it felt surprisingly simple. He was going home. Not because he had lost his job. Not because his relationship had ended. Because he was finally ready to stop running from parts of his own story. And he could only hope it wasn't too late. The drive home took nearly 8 hours. For most of the trip, Ethan drove in silence. The radio remained off. His phone stayed untouched on the passenger seat. Outside the window, cities gave way to suburbs, suburbs gave way to open stretches of highway, and familiar landmarks slowly began to appear. With every mile, memories surfaced. Some were happy. Others weren't. He remembered basketball games, school projects, late-night conversations at the kitchen table, and handwritten notes tucked beside breakfast bowls. He remembered promises. Promises he had made. Promises he had forgotten. Most of all, he remembered the person who had been there through every chapter of his life. No matter how difficult those chapters became. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, Ethan finally pulled into the parking lot of the apartment complex where he had grown up. The building looked smaller than he remembered. Older too. But there was something comforting about seeing it again. For a few moments, he remained inside the car. Watching. Thinking. Trying to gather the courage he suddenly wasn't sure he possessed. Job interviews had never made him nervous. Public speaking didn't make him nervous. Walking to his mother's front door did. Because this wasn't about confidence. It was about accountability. Eventually, he stepped out of the car and made his way toward the familiar staircase. Each step seemed heavier than the last. When he finally reached apartment 3B, he stopped. The same door. The same hallway. The same place he had left behind. Only now, it felt different. Because he was different. He stood there for several seconds before finally knocking. Once. Then twice. A few moments later, he heard footsteps approaching. The lock clicked. The door opened. And there she was. Maria. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Neither seemed entirely sure where to begin. Time had passed. Not a lifetime. But enough. Enough for new lines to appear around her eyes. Enough for a little more gray to find its way into her hair. Enough for Ethan to realize how many moments he had missed. His throat tightened immediately. Mom. The word came out softer than he intended. Maria blinked in surprise. Ethan? He had imagined this moment 100 different ways during the drive home. Long speeches. Perfect apologies. Carefully chosen words. Yet standing in front of her, none of those words remained. Only the truth. I'm sorry. The sentence escaped before he could think about it. Maria studied him quietly. Not angry. Not cold. Just thoughtful. As though she were trying to understand everything contained inside those two words. Finally, she stepped aside. Come in. The invitation felt like a gift. The apartment looked almost exactly the same. The familiar couch. The kitchen. Table. The framed photographs. The scent of coffee lingering in the air. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something he hadn't realized he was missing. Peace. They sat together at the kitchen table. The same table where he had once completed homework assignments, celebrated report cards, and talked about dreams that felt impossibly far away. For a while, neither spoke. Then Maria broke the silence. How was the drive? The question caught him off guard. Not because it was important. Because it was normal. And normal suddenly felt extraordinary. Long. She nodded. I imagine so. A small smile appeared between them. Awkward. Tentative. But real. Eventually, Ethan took a deep breath. I should have called more. Maria remained silent. I should have visited more. Still silent. I should have opened the gift. That finally earned a reaction. A tiny smile. I wondered when you'd get around to that. For the first time, Ethan laughed. A short laugh. A sad one. But genuine. Then his expression grew serious again. Mom, I need you to know something. She waited. When I asked you not to come to graduation. His voice faltered. I wasn't ashamed of you. Maria looked at him carefully. What were you ashamed of? The question hit harder than he expected. Because he had never actually asked himself that. Not honestly. Not completely. After a long pause, he finally answered. I think I was ashamed of feeling different. The room fell quiet. Ethan continued. Everyone around me seemed so confident. Their families knew how that world worked. Mine didn't. Maria listened without interruption. I spent years trying to prove I belonged. He swallowed. And somewhere along the way, I started treating parts of my own life like obstacles. The admission felt painful. Necessary. But painful. His eyes filled with tears. You were never the problem. Maria looked down at her coffee for a moment. Then back at him. I know. The answer surprised him. You do? She smiled gently. Ethan, I raised you. For the first time since arriving, he felt the weight on his chest begin to ease. Not disappear. Just ease. Because she understood something he was only beginning to understand. Himself. The issue had never been a lack of love. It had been fear. Fear disguised as ambition. Fear disguised as success. Fear disguised as belonging. The conversation continued for hours. Not all at once. Not in dramatic speeches. In pieces. Small truths shared gradually. The way real healing often happens. Eventually, Ethan told her about losing his job. About the breakup. About the uncertainty he had been carrying. Maria listened carefully. When he finished, she nodded. Sounds like you've had a difficult year. He laughed softly. That's one way to put it. Another silence settled between them. Comfortable this time. Then Maria stood and disappeared into her bedroom. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a worn cardboard box. Ethan immediately recognized it. The same box she had been protecting for years. What is that? Maria smiled. Something I've been meaning to show you. She placed it carefully on the table. The box was filled with memories. Report cards. Certificates. Drawings. Photographs. Pieces of a life neither of them had thought about in years. Ethan stared at the contents in disbelief. You kept all of this? Maria looked genuinely confused by the question. Of course. He picked up an old spelling bee ribbon. Then a soccer photo. Then a science fair certificate. Every item seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they told a story. His story. The story of a boy whose mother never stopped paying attention. No matter how busy life became. No matter how tired she was. No matter how many jobs she worked. At the very bottom of the box sat a small photograph. A picture of the two of them standing outside their apartment when he was 12 years old. He had seen the image before. Recently, in fact. But this time he noticed something written on the back. In Maria's handwriting. My greatest accomplishment. Ethan stared at the words. Unable to speak. Unable to look away. For years, he had measured success through achievements. Degrees. Jobs. Titles. Income. His mother had measured it differently. To her, success had always been far simpler. It had been him. Not what he accomplished. Not what he earned. Him. The realization hit harder than any professional setback ever could. As tears filled his eyes once again, Ethan thought their story was finally beginning to make sense. What he didn't realize was that his mother still hadn't told him everything. And the next thing she showed him would change the way he viewed her sacrifices forever. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The cardboard box sat open between us, its contents spread across the kitchen table like pieces of a life neither of us had fully appreciated until now. Photographs. Report cards. Certificates. Drawings. Small reminders of moments that once felt ordinary. Looking at them now, they felt anything but ordinary. Each item represented time. Attention. Care. Things that are easy to overlook when you're young and almost impossible to repay when you're older. I picked up a faded soccer photo and laughed. I barely played that season. Maria smiled. You scored one goal. One lucky goal. It still counted. We both laughed. For the first time in years, the conversation felt effortless. Not because the past had been erased. Because neither of us was trying to avoid it anymore. As the evening continued, I began sorting through the contents of the box more carefully. That's when I noticed a thick folder tucked beneath several old photographs. The folder looked different from everything else. Less sentimental. More practical. Curious, I opened it. Inside were documents. Loan statements. Payment records. Financial paperwork. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I recognized my university's name. My stomach tightened. I turned another page. Then another. The pattern became impossible to miss. Tuition payments. Housing expenses. Education-related loans. Years of records carefully organized and preserved. I looked up. Mom. She immediately knew what I had found. Her expression told me so. You kept all of this? Maria took a sip of coffee before answering. I keep everything important. I looked back down at the paperwork. The numbers were larger than I expected. Much larger. Growing up, I always knew money had been tight. What I never understood was how close she had come to financial disaster trying to keep my opportunities alive. Why didn't you tell me? Maria shrugged gently. You were in college. The answer sounded almost absurd. As though it explained everything. Yet somehow, it did. For her, protecting my future had always taken priority over sharing her worries. Even when those worries were significant. Especially then. I continued reading. The loan payments stretched across years. Some had clearly required sacrifices I never knew about. Others had been refinanced multiple times to reduce monthly costs. The more I read, the more uncomfortable I became. Not because I blamed her. Because I realized how little I had asked. For years, I accepted her support without fully understanding its cost. A few pages later, another document caught my attention. This one wasn't financial. It was medical. I frowned. What's this? Maria immediately looked away. That reaction alone made me nervous. Mom? It was nothing serious. Which, in my experience, usually means the opposite. I reviewed the paperwork. Not a hospital stay. Not surgery. A visit to the emergency department. Observation overnight. Severe exhaustion and dehydration. The date stopped me cold. It had happened during my sophomore year of college. The same semester I was preparing for internship interviews. The same semester I had spent weeks complaining about stress. The same semester I rarely called home. I looked at her. You never told me. Maria gave a small smile. I was fine. That's not the point. It was to me. The answer frustrated me because it sounded exactly like something she would say. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked quietly, what happened? Maria leaned back in her chair. For the first time all evening, she seemed reluctant to answer. Eventually, she sighed. I ignored being tired longer than I should have. I waited. A coworker found me sitting on the floor during a night shift. My chest tightened. They took me to the emergency room. The simplicity of the story somehow made it worse. No dramatic accident. No tragedy. Just exhaustion. The kind that builds slowly over months until the body finally demands attention. How long were you there? One night. I closed my eyes. One night. One night I never knew existed. One night my mother spent under medical observation while I was worrying about internships and networking events. The realization left me speechless. Maria seemed to notice. Ethan. I looked up. You weren't supposed to know. The statement stunned me. What do you mean? I wasn't hiding it from you. She paused. I just didn't think it was your burden to carry. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Because that sentence perfectly summarized my entire childhood. Every struggle. Every difficult decision. Every sacrifice. She had carried them quietly whenever possible. Not because she enjoyed it. Because she believed that was her job. Eventually, I looked down at the paperwork again. Then back at her. You shouldn't have had to do all of this alone. A sad smile crossed her face. Maybe not. It was the first time all evening she had admitted that. The honesty surprised me. Then she added, but I wasn't really alone. I frowned. What do you mean? Maria looked toward a framed photograph of my father sitting on a nearby shelf. Then she smiled. I had a reason. The room fell silent. Because we both understood exactly what she meant. For years, I had viewed sacrifice through the lens of effort. Hours worked. Bills paid. Debt accumulated. Now I was beginning to understand something deeper. The hardest part of sacrifice isn't giving things up. It's continuing to believe the sacrifice matters while no one is watching. My mother had done that for decades. Not because she knew the outcome. Because she believed in the possibility of it. Eventually, Maria stood and disappeared into her bedroom once again. When she returned, she carried a small notebook. The cover was worn. The pages slightly bent. Clearly old. She placed it on the table. I looked at it curiously. A journal? She nodded. Sort of. I opened it carefully. The entries were short. Sometimes only a few sentences. Others barely filled half a page. Most revolved around ordinary moments. Things many people would have forgotten. A basketball game. A science project. A report card. A difficult week at school. Page after page revealed the same pattern. She had been paying attention. Always. Even when I assumed she was too busy. One entry made me laugh. Ethan insists he can fix the toaster. I should probably stop him. Another read, today he helped carry groceries without being asked. I didn't tell him, but it made my entire day. The entries continued year after year. Not documenting achievements. Documenting moments. The little things that make up a life. Then I found an entry dated the day of my college graduation. My hands froze. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. Eventually, I began reading. The entry was short. Very short. It said, today Ethan graduated. I watched him walk across that stage and felt grateful. His father would have been proud. So am I. Always. That was it. Nothing about disappointment. Nothing about hurt feelings. Nothing about tears. Just gratitude. Just pride. Just love. I closed the journal slowly. My vision blurred. Because for the second time that evening, I realized something I should have understood years ago. My mother had never measured my worth by my mistakes. Not at graduation. Not afterward. Not ever. She had always seen the whole picture. The boy. The teenager. The young man. The flaws. The strengths. All of it. And somehow, she kept loving me through every version. For a long moment, I simply sat there looking across the table at her. The woman who had worked 3 jobs. Signed loans she couldn't comfortably afford. Driven herself too hard. Sacrificed opportunities. Given up comforts. And still found enough energy to believe in me. Then another realization arrived. One even harder to accept. For most of my life, I thought success was something my mother helped me achieve. Sitting there that night, I finally understood the truth. My mother wasn't part of the story of my success. She was the reason the story existed at all. And for the first time, I found myself wondering how I could ever thank someone for that. What I didn't know was that life was about to give me the opportunity. Several years later, standing in front of thousands of people, I would finally find the words. The words I should have said long ago. 5 years later, life looked very different. Not perfect. Not effortless. Just different. The years following my return home hadn't magically erased old wounds, but they had given both my mother and me something we hadn't had in a long time. Time. Time to talk. Time to rebuild trust. Time to create new memories instead of constantly revisiting old mistakes. Looking back, I think that's what healing really is. Not forgetting. Not pretending. Simply choosing to keep moving forward together. Over those 5 years, I rebuilt my career. Eventually, I found work with a leadership consulting firm that focused on helping organizations develop young professionals. The work suited me in ways my previous job never had. For the first time, I wasn't chasing status. I was chasing purpose. The difference turned out to matter more than I expected. As my career grew, I occasionally received invitations to speak at conferences, universities, and professional events. Most of the talks focused on leadership, resilience, and personal growth. People often asked about success. What it meant. How to achieve it. How to maintain it. Every time the question came up, I found myself thinking about my mother. Because the older I became, the more I realized how incomplete most conversations about success really are. People love discussing achievement. They rarely discuss sacrifice. One autumn afternoon, I was invited to speak at a large university leadership conference. The audience included students, parents, faculty members, and business leaders from across the state. More than 3,000 people attended. When I arrived backstage, organizers rushed around making final preparations while volunteers directed guests to their seats. The atmosphere felt energetic but calm. I reviewed my notes one final time. Then I looked toward the audience. Near the front sat my mother. Maria Johnson. 60 years old now. Working fewer hours than she once did, though she still insisted on staying busy. Some habits never change. Earlier that morning, I had driven to pick her up myself. She claimed she could have driven alone. I ignored her. Some arguments aren't worth losing. As the event began, speakers took turns discussing leadership, innovation, and career development. Eventually, my name was announced. The audience applauded politely as I walked onto the stage. For the next 40 minutes, I shared stories about failure, growth, resilience, and the lessons I had learned throughout my career. The presentation went well. People laughed at the right moments. They nodded at the serious ones. Everything unfolded exactly as expected. Then I reached the final section. The only part one truly cared about. I paused and looked across the audience. Thousands of faces stared back. Students preparing for their futures. Parents quietly hoping those futures would be bright. Families carrying stories nobody else could see. The sight reminded me of graduation day years earlier. A different stage. A different audience. A different version of myself. I took a breath. People often ask me what made me successful. The room grew quieter. They ask about education. A pause. They ask about career decisions. Another pause. They ask about opportunities. Several audience members nodded. I smiled. And those things matter. Then I shook my head. But they're not the whole story. The room became still. The truth is, none of us arrive anywhere by ourselves. A few people exchanged glances. Others leaned forward. We like to imagine success as an individual achievement. I paused. But behind every accomplishment is usually someone whose name never appears on the diploma, the promotion, or the award. The silence deepened. I looked toward the front row. Toward my mother. She immediately looked uncomfortable. That alone made me smile. Some things never change. My father passed away when I was 6 years old. The audience listened carefully. My mother raised me on her own. I could see her shaking her head slightly. Already embarrassed. Already wishing I would move on. I didn't. She worked more hours than I understood at the time. My voice softened. She cleaned houses. Worked restaurant shifts. Cleaned office buildings at night. The room remained completely silent. Not because the story was dramatic. Because it was familiar. Many people in the audience knew someone like her. Or were someone like her. For a moment, I thought about stopping there. But some truths deserve to be spoken aloud. Especially when they have waited years to be heard. There was a period in my life when I became more concerned with being accepted than being honest about where I came from. The admission felt different now. Less painful. More necessary. I spent too much time worrying about how other people saw me. Several students nodded. I recognized the expression. The desire to belong. The fear of being judged. The pressure to become someone impressive. I knew that feeling well. The problem is that when you're busy running from parts of your story, you eventually start running from yourself. The room stayed quiet. I glanced toward my mother again. She was listening now. Not embarrassed. Just listening. And while I was trying to prove myself to the world, my mother kept doing what she had always done. A pause. Believing in me. I swallowed. Suddenly aware of how much that simple sentence meant. There were moments when I didn't deserve that belief. My voice cracked slightly. She gave it anyway. For several seconds, no one spoke. The silence felt heavier than applause ever could. Then I smiled. Not at the audience. At her. The most important lesson I've learned about success is that it means very little if it costs you the people who helped you get there. A few audience members wiped their eyes. Others reached for the hands of family members sitting beside them. I continued. The strongest person I have ever known isn't a CEO. A small smile appeared. It isn't a celebrity. A few people laughed softly. It isn't anyone whose name appears in history books. Then I looked directly at my mother. The strongest person I have ever known is Maria Johnson. For a moment, the room remained completely still. Then a few people began applauding. Not everyone. Just a few. Then more joined them. And then more. Within seconds, much of the audience had risen to their feet. The applause wasn't loud because of me. It was for her. For every parent who worked unseen. For every sacrifice that never appeared on a resume. For every act of love that quietly shaped a life. Maria looked overwhelmed. She shook her head. Repeatedly, as though trying to reject the attention. Then she laughed through tears. The same way she always had whenever emotions became too big for words. When the applause finally settled, I stepped down from the stage and walked toward the front row. The audience was still clapping softly. People smiled as I passed. A few wiped away tears. Most simply looked thoughtful. I stopped in front of my mother. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Some conversations had already happened years earlier at a small kitchen table. Others had taken place through forgiveness, patience, and time. Finally, she stood. And hugged me. The hug wasn't dramatic. It wasn't symbolic. It was simply a mother hugging her son. The same way she had hundreds of times before. Only now, I understood its value. Later that evening, after the conference ended and the crowds dispersed, we sat together outside the venue watching the sunset. The sky glowed with shades of gold and orange. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable. The kind that only exists between people who no longer need to prove anything to each other. Eventually, my mother smiled. You did a good job. I laughed. I had a good teacher. She rolled her eyes. Then looked toward the horizon. For several minutes, we watched the sun slowly disappear. Finally, I asked a question. Do you know what I used to think success was? She glanced at me. What? I smiled. I thought success was how far I could go. And now? I looked at the woman who had spent decades helping me find my way. Now I finally understood. I think success is knowing what matters when you get there. My mother squeezed my hand. And somehow, that simple gesture felt more valuable than every promotion, title, or achievement I had ever received. Because in the end, the greatest gift she gave me wasn't an education. It wasn't sacrifice. It wasn't opportunity. It was perspective. She taught me that success without gratitude feels empty. Achievement without character doesn't last. And love, when it is given freely and consistently over a lifetime, becomes one of the most powerful forces in the world. As the last light disappeared, beyond the horizon, I realized something that had taken me years to learn. The story of my life was never really about success. It was about the people who made success possible. And if there was one lesson worth passing on, it was this: never become so focused on where you're going that you forget who walked beside you to get there. The end.